Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. Imagine you're just minding your business, trying to have a nice, relaxing evening in your pool, when you start to hear some concerning sounds coming from next door. January 16th, 1997 was a brisk and chilly night, perfect for a quick dip in the pool. That relaxing night was interrupted by groans and moans. It was around 10:30 p.m. that evening, and Greg Coons and his girlfriend Stephanie Reedhead had just gotten out and were getting ready for bed. Greg and Stephanie live next door to the Falater family. Scott and Yarmila Falater had been high school sweethearts and had been married for almost 20 years. Scott worked as a computer engineer for Motorola, and Yarmila worked at a preschool as a teacher's aide. They had 2 children together, Michael, who was 12 years old at the time, and Megan, who was 15. The sounds Greg and Stephanie heard varied from screams to loud moans. Initially, they had thought that the couple were getting busy. When Greg had peeped over the fence, he saw his neighbor Yarmila lying alone on the ground. He noticed that a light was on inside the house, and he could see through a second-story window that Scott was standing there. Greg saw Scott was changing his shirt and moving around doing something, but he couldn't tell what. The Falater's dog had started barking, and a few minutes later, Scott had returned downstairs and had tried to quiet the dog. After Scott had eventually calmed down their dog, he went out to the backyard, picked up Yarmila, threw her into the pool, and proceeded to hold her underwater. After seeing this, Greg was like, "Whatever this is not okay," and he quickly called police. He told the operator that he had heard some concerning sounds coming from his neighbor's yard, and when he looked over the fence, he saw his neighbor throw his wife into the pool, and it appeared that he was purposely holding her head underwater. When police arrived, they went to the backyard where they found Yarmila's lifeless body floating in the pool. When they pulled her out, they also discovered that she had been stabbed multiple times. When they went inside to talk with Scott, he seemed confused and disoriented. It was as if he had seen police for the first time and was acting surprised that they were at his house, as if he didn't just let them in. When they asked Scott how many people were in the house, he answered 4. He acted as though he did not know that his wife was dead. Megan and Michael had been asleep upstairs the entire time, and when interviewed, they both said that neither of them had heard anything. Scott was then brought to the police station to be interviewed, and because his neighbor Greg had essentially caught him in the act, they were expecting a quick confession. However, this was not the case. Scott claimed he had no memory of killing his wife, and that he can't believe that his friend and neighbor had told police that he was drowning his wife. He thought there had to have been a mistake. How could he say he saw something that Scott had absolutely no recollection of? Interestingly, during Scott's interrogation, he never said that he didn't kill his wife. He just had no memory of it, which to me strikes pretty odd. His primary argument was that he didn't remember anything, which, yes, Scott, we've established. The Falaters' friends and family told police that, to the best of their knowledge, the couple never fought. This was also confirmed by the couple's children, and they said whenever their parents had a disagreement or a little argument, which were already far and few in between, they always were able to resolve it and never went to bed angry. During Yarmila's autopsy, the medical examiner had found that she had water in her lungs and that Yarmila had been stabbed 44 times, mostly to her chest, back, upper arms, and hands. Many of her abrasions were consistent with defense wounds. When the police returned to the Falater's home to investigate, they found Scott's car in the garage, and when they looked in the back, they found a plastic container that held a bloody knife wrapped in a sock. In the back seat, they also found several pieces of blood-stained clothes. Remember, Greg had seen Scott upstairs changing clothes, so it is possible that Scott had gone to the garage to stash his clothes immediately after the attack and had tried to hide the murder weapon before he went back outside to try and calm down his barking dog. During one of the many interviews conducted by police, they had reached out to several family members, one of them being Scott's sister. She said that she might know why Scott didn't remember this brutal attack. She told police that Scott had a history of sleepwalking and told them of an instance when she was a young teenager and Scott had come into her room and began attacking her. It is thought that Scott had become violent when she had tried to wake him out of it, or it's possible that she startled him, and that's what triggered this violent reaction. Could it be possible that Scott was actually sleepwalking when he killed Yarmila? Hoping for some answers, Scott had agreed to participate in a sleep clinic where he was monitored for 4 nights. While there, his brain waves were monitored while he slept to measure his sleeping patterns. The results of this sleep study revealed that Scott had showed characteristics of something called synchronous delta waves, which was a symptom associated with people who sleepwalk. A sleep doctor indicated that this was also a sign of neurological immaturity. Okay, so we've established that Scott legitimately sleepwalks. But does that mean he's innocent here? During an earlier interview, Scott had told police that he was trying to fix a broken pump in the pool on the night of Yarmila's death. He said he didn't finish the project before Yarmila had called him in for dinner. He then went inside, had dinner, and told his family of the problems he was having at work, and told them how he was so stressed out and didn't know what to do. At the Motorola office, one of the larger projects that Scott was overseeing was possibly going to be canceled, meaning all of his employees would be laid off. After dinner, Scott had said he had some computer work to do, and when he finished, he headed to bed alone as Yarmila was still up, watching TV downstairs. The sleep clinic doctor believes that when Scott went to bed, he still had all of this unfinished business on his mind and the stress of the pool work, in addition to the possibility of all these people on his team at work losing their jobs, just overpowered his mind. They believe that while still in a state of sleep, he had gotten up and decided to finish the job. While still asleep, he got up, got dressed, grabbed a flashlight, and headed downstairs. On his way outside, he stopped in the kitchen and grabbed a knife out of the drawer. He then headed outside and closed the door behind him. After a while, Jarmila had gotten up off the couch and went to see what Scott was up to outside. It was getting pretty late, and she wanted him to come back inside and get him back up to bed. When Jarmila came up behind Scott at the edge of the pool, she startled him, and Scott reacted violently. A common reason for sleepwalkers sleepwalking is that they are experiencing some level of stress due to something that had happened earlier, or the stress of an unfinished event or circumstance that they carry on with them while in a state of sleep. They continue on with their project or event, and if interrupted, they have a fight or flight reaction as they feel the need to complete the project. Apparently, while sleepwalking, a sleepwalker isn't able to distinguish faces, so despite knowing someone, they still might attack, as they don't have the ability to recognize them as someone they know. They just see them as a stranger, and because of this, have the likelihood to attack. Although there have been documented cases of sleepwalkers committing violent crimes and later having the cases dismissed because they were legitimately in another state of being and clearly not doing something premeditated, in Scott's case, investigators weren't so sure this wasn't. As police were looking for a motive, they had found out that Scott and Jarmila's marriage wasn't as happy as their family and friends had thought. Scott was a devout Mormon and spent a lot of time doing church activities. He often attended functions alone and would choose the church over spending time with his family. Jarmila was getting more and more fed up with the time Scott was spending away from home. It was actually getting to the point where Jarmila was considering asking Scott for a divorce. Another point of contention between the couple was the fact that Scott had wanted more children and Jarmila did not. She was already feeling a strain from the pressures of the church, and this was just another frequent argument they had. Both of their children were in their teens, and Jarmila just didn't see having more children as the best thing for their family. Although unproven, there was also suspicion that one of them was having an affair. You can imagine that something like this would inevitably cause more problems on top of what they were already experiencing. In an effort to build a case against Scott, prosecutors decided to hire their own independent sleep doctor to monitor Scott's sleep, as well as analyze his behavior on the night of Jarmila's murder. They were looking for any trace evidence that would point towards Scott actually sleepwalking. The sleep specialist found that Scott's test results were actually consistent with someone who suffered from sleep apnea and nothing more. His brain waves did not show the same patterns as someone who is a documented sleepwalker. This, of course, was in this instance, he was only monitored for 4 days, and a sleepwalker might not sleepwalk every day, but this is what their specialist found. Scott had told police that on the night of Jarmila's death, he had fallen asleep with his contacts in. This was very unusual for him to do, as taking them out was part of his regular bedtime routine. At one point during the night, he had gotten got dressed and walked to the backyard. Before going outside, he had put on a jacket and grabbed a flashlight. Because sleepwalkers are unable to distinguish night from day, it's interesting that he knew he would need a flashlight to see because it was dark out, and purposely put on a jacket, seemingly indicating that he knew it was cold outside. Very uncharacteristic of a sleepwalker to have this level, if any, of awareness. The witness, Greg, the fellator's next-door neighbor, saw Scott in the upstairs window taking off his bloody clothes. It was understood that Scott was in some level of awareness to be doing this in the first place. He then bunched up his bloody clothes and grabbed the knife he used to stab his wife and put them in a plastic container with a lid, and then walked out to the garage. He then attempted to conceal the container in the trunk of his car. Again, it is understood that he had some conscious state of mind to go out of his way to do this. After stashing the container, he then returned to the upstairs bathroom to wrap his hand in gauze as he noticed he had gotten a cut. A sleepwalker would not be aware of something like this. Scott would have had to have been awake. Scott had claimed to have not been able to hear any screaming from his wife, but he was apparently aware enough to calm his barking dog, again, as told by the eyewitnesses, Greg and Stephanie. Scott's defense team argued that Scott was not aware of his dog in terms of hearing him barking. Rather, he felt the dog jumping on him, and by coming into physical contact with him, he was unconsciously aware. The dog barking or not barking would have made no difference. The dog coming into contact with him was what he was responding to. When Greg made his initial statement about what he had seen in the fellator's yard, he recalls how Scott was standing over Yarmilla's body and had a glazed over look and was seemingly looking indifferent to his wife's lifeless body in front of him. Scott's trial began in June of 1999. He had pleaded not guilty to killing his wife. His defense team's main argument was that he was absolutely asleep during this attack, and he was completely unaware of his actions. His brain was asleep, but his body had taken over, being in a state of unconsciousness. He was extremely sad and remorseful and loved his wife. He had no motivation to kill her. He did not know what he was doing. The prosecution, however, argued that he knew exactly what he was doing and had purposely gone out of his way to kill her and make absolute sure that she was dead. They had described how he had stabbed her and then put her in the water and continued to assault her after that. This was a conscious sequence of events that he had done on purpose to kill his wife and make it look like an unknown assailant had done it. They believe that Scott had waited until late at night when both of their children had gone to bed. He knew that Yarmilla would be up watching TV, as she regularly did. Scott initially alluded to Yarmilla surprising him outside, but prosecutors suspect that Scott had somehow lured her outside to the pool and then attacked her. After stabbing her, He rushed upstairs to get out of his bloody clothes and returned after stashing them and the knife in his car. Once back outside, he calmed down his dog and looked over at Yarmila. He stood motionless as he realized she was still breathing, but just barely. He walked over with a glazed look and dragged her into the pool and proceeded to drown her. It is heavily suspected that Scott intended to stab his wife, leave her there in the yard, and then go back to bed. He expected his children to find her in the morning, dead. What a horrific and traumatizing thing to do to your children. He might have gotten away with it, but unbeknownst to Scott, his neighbor Greg had seen the whole thing. Prosecutors believe that Scott was intending on getting away with the murder since he had heard of other cases where sleepwalking was used as a defense. The evidence had proved that as many as 65 inconsistencies with sleepwalking that Scott was confirmed as doing that would not have been plausible if he was actually asleep and sleepwalking. It is said that just him coming in contact with the cold pool water would have woken him up. Scott was absolutely awake and aware on the night of his wife's murder. The defense then argued that if he did kill his wife, why would he leave all this evidence there that would point directly to him? Like, I don't know, why would you? He was definitely sleepwalking. I'm not sure I would consider purposely putting my bloody clothes and murder weapon in a sealed container and then hiding it in my trunk, leaving the evidence out. But okay. Scott then took the stand in his own defense. He reiterated that he was asleep and something in his brain must have been broken. After hearing all of the evidence, the jury found Scott Falater guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He is currently serving his sentence at the Yerma Prison Complex, Cibola Unit in San Luis. Most recently, Scott says that he has not forgiven himself, and he does not deny killing his wife. He also believes that Yarmila would have been understanding. So take with that what you will. I certainly wouldn't be. I think that his life sentence was fair, but what do you think? Do you think he was legitimately sleepwalking and had no knowledge of what he was doing? Or do you think he thought he would get away with it? I think he thought he was going to get away with it. The heroes of this story today were Greg and Stephanie because they saw something and they said something. And with that, that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.